Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Zach is Cinema. Today, we are going to be doing something just a little bit different. If you're finding me for the first time, or you've been keeping up with my Evil Dead movie franchise review series, we have finally concluded here. Guys, we made it. Congratulations, because today we just finished up reviewing and discussing Evil Dead Burn, so we are now going to stop and rank all 6 films in the Evil Dead franchise, all the way from my least favorite all the way up to my personal favorite. So this is obviously a very unique franchise and a unique ranking list where I don't think this franchise has put out a bad film yet, and that is including our brand new one, Evil Dead Burn. All these movies I'd give a very positive grade to, would recommend to other people, and would happily watch any of these again. So even in my last place, please keep this in mind. This is still a movie that I overall enjoy. So we're going to be starting with my number 6 spot, which will be Evil Dead Rise. And just like I said, this franchise does not have a bad film in it, and that includes Evil Dead Rise. Every movie in this franchise really brings something very unique to the table, and Rise is still a very entertaining horror film that also brought something new to the franchise that is Evil Dead, and I would rewatch it. It just happens to be the one I connected to and is least memorable in my opinion. But one thing I really appreciated with this film is the new setting, the family dynamic and unit that it really introduced here. It is exactly the kind of change this franchise needed, because I was happy that it wasn't content in just making another Cabin in the Woods style horror film or style Evil Dead film. I love how we moved the Deadites into this old, decrepit apartment building skyscraper, and centering the story around a family kind of gives this movie a very unique identity in and of itself. To me, it proves again that the Evil Dead franchise and movies can really work outside of that Cabin in the Woods setting while still feeling just like a standard Evil Dead movie in the best way possible. In my opinion, in this one, Alyssa Sutherland completely steals the show and proves to be one of the best Deadite performances within the franchise. I love how they write the character of Alyssa Sutherland in here, and once she's in her Deadite form, they really utilize that to its full effect. They weaponize her motherhood against her own children, against her own family, and between her slower, more pain-based transformation, the creepy dialogue, and the emotional manipulation, she becomes one of the biggest reasons this movie does have standout sequences to me, is because of the scenes with Alyssa Sutherland as Ellie. And to me, the third act is when this movie really finds its footing, finds its groove overall. While I have a lot of mixed feelings with the story and characters as a whole, I absolutely adore this movie's finale. The family Deadite is one of the franchise's most creative, unique-looking Deadite monster creature designs, and the entire wood chipper sequence is brutal, memorable, and exactly the over-the-top third act Evil Dead payoff you're looking for here. It is easily the strongest part of the film. But the reason it's coming in last place here in my ranking is because it feels like the first Evil Dead movie in this franchise that just feels like it's remixing the formula instead of redefining it and creating its own path overall. Rise definitely changes the location here, but outside of that, I often found myself recognizing familiar beats instead of being very surprised with them. The characters never connected with me as much as I hoped they would, and a few plot decisions here feel forced, and outside of Ellie and the finale, this is probably the most forgettable entry in the series to me. That's why it lands at the bottom of my ranking, not because it's bad, but it's really hard besides the wood chipper sequence to pull any memorable sequence out of this film, and didn't really latch into any of the characters, and almost kind of feels like we're going through the Evil Dead formula and Evil Dead beats instead of redefining it in a unique way for this franchise. So to me, unfortunately, I got to put Evil Dead Rise in my last place, coming in at number 6. But coming in at number 5 is Army of Darkness. And honestly, this might be the Evil Dead movie that, in a way, I kind of respect the most. Even though it's fourth on my list, this might actually be the Evil Dead movie that just kind of gives me some admiration for the filmmakers in Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell. It's kind of unbelievable that Sam Raimi was even allowed by the studio to make a medieval fantasy adventure to follow up Evil Dead 1 and 2 and not even call it Evil Dead 3 Army of Darkness. Like, on paper, this movie really shouldn't exist, but Raimi commits to his idea, his vision, and somehow makes one of the most unique entries in the franchise that also really fits into the franchise as a whole. And one of the reasons why I love this franchise, and specifically Army of Darkness, is these first 3 films feel like completely different subgenres within the horror subgenre. The original is straight horror, Evil Dead 2 is more of a horror comedy, and Army of Darkness becomes a full-blown medieval fantasy hero's journey adventure surrounded by an Evil Dead skin. Very few franchises are willing to reinvent themselves this dramatically while still feeling so connected, and that's one of the biggest reasons this movie in particular deserves a lot of credit for me. And I feel like Ash really becomes Ash in Evil Dead 2, but I feel like this is where Ash becomes almost like a legend in the horror community. Bruce Campbell is firing on all cylinders in this movie between the endless one-liners, the physical comedy, and watching Ash transform into this larger than life hero and savior. It's quite possibly impossible to not have fun with this film. Whether he's fighting miniature versions of himself, building medieval weapons, training an army for battle, this movie cements Ash as one of horror's most iconic protagonists. And I think this has one of the longest third acts in an Evil Dead film. And once that battle sequence starts, the movie never lets up. I love watching Ash train his army, prepare for war. It is such a fun, over-the-top payoff that delivers really well here. And the finale really embraces the movie's over-the-top personality from start to finish. It's one of those endings where you could just tell everyone had so much fun creating and designing the spectacle that they were just about to shoot and make together. But the reason it's coming in at my number 5 spot is just because it drifts away from what I traditionally go to an Evil Dead movie for. As much as I enjoy the comedy and fantasy elements within this film, this is also the entry where the franchise starts leaving the horror behind, when this over-the-top premise I feel like was a perfect opportunity to go bigger, bolder, and more blood-fueled. I miss the relentless atmosphere, unsettling deadites in this film, and the over-the-top practical gore that made the first couple films so memorable. And I also just have to be in the right mood for this movie. It is very goofy, slapstick, very comedy-driven, and when I'm in the mood for it, it works as a campy, cheesy horror movie. But when I'm not, I'm definitely not, and not going to get too much out of it here. So I tend to revisit the darker entries, so I could see this being somebody's number 1. I could also see this being someone's last place. To me, kind of right there in the middle, because number 5 is Army of Darkness for me. But coming in at number 4 is the brand new one, Evil Dead Burn. And one of the biggest reasons this is coming above Rise and Army of Darkness for me is just because I absolutely love the portrayal of the Deadites in this film. In this franchise, the Evil Dead franchise really pushes each Deadite to really have their own unique personality, flair, and style. And this time in this movie, in Burn, they feel faster, more feral, and unbelievably aggressive and mean-spirited. Once the horror begins, the movie really rarely lets up, and the Deadites become some of the most intimidating figures this franchise has ever seen. And on top of that, this movie has so many standout sequences and genuine sequences that really made me squirm and feel that phantom pain. Whether it's the fishing wire sequence from the beginning, the 2 different dishwasher sequences that we get, one with a character landing on silverware and one with that same character using the dishwasher panel to bash in his girlfriend's face. The incredibly uncomfortable ear moment, the ear canal moment with the pen, the car door sequence with the fingers getting trapped in it. Burn just constantly delivers those classic Evil Dead moments that leave you feeling the phantom pain even the next day. And I do really appreciate this filmmaker's style, this visual style Burn goes for. The editing, transitions, cinematography, and fire scorched aesthetic really helps create to give Burn its own identity here. There are multiple shots throughout the movie that look like they belong on posters, and visually at times, besides the CGI third act, this one is one of the best looking films in the franchise. But I think the biggest thing holding this back for me and my placement on the list here is just the movie kind of holding itself back from its emotional side to the story. I actually think this setup is very interesting. A woman trapped with her abusive husband's family after his sudden tragic death. Very interesting, but I don't think it took enough time fully developing all those characters and relationship dynamics before the horror takes over. And because of that, Alice, our main protagonist here, never really connects with me the way that Ash or Mia did from 2013. The emotional payoff could have been stronger, and you see that there, especially with this being the longest Evil Dead movie. I just wish they spent a little bit more time really fully developing that. And more than anything, the finale and third act really holds this movie back for me. After spending so much time of setting up Will as this ultimate fire-burned deadite, I found the final form surprisingly underwhelming. The movie leans way too heavily in CGI in the third act and way too much for an Evil Dead movie, and the climax just never really leads to the insanity, brutality, blood-soaked adventure that the Evil Dead movies are really known for. And even though I have a lot of issues with the film, overall I had a really great time, especially the first 85% of the movie. I think it's just the payoff that really kind of made this dwindle just a little bit here. But for me, coming in at number 4 is Evil Dead Burn. But coming in at number 3 is going to be the original The Evil Dead. It's honestly hard to overstate how impressive this movie was when you remember this was Sam Raimi's feature film debut made on a micro budget with a group of his friends. It launched one of horror's greatest franchises ever while introducing the world to Raimi and Bruce Campbell. And over 40 years later, it still holds up in my opinion. And on top of just enjoying this movie overall, I think more than anything else, I think the original Evil Dead to me just showcases pure filmmaking creativity. The camera work, the sound design, practical effects, the way that Raimi creates atmosphere with almost no resources is incredibly amazing. It is incredibly motivating too. Every time I watch this, I just kind of get inspired personally. And I love here how Raimi, before the Deadites even are fully arrived, the movie makes the cabin and atmosphere and setting really feel cursed. Between the creepy score, the camera stalking characters throughout the woods and their living situation, the constant feeling that something is watching these characters from the outside perspective, the overwhelming sense of dread that never really lets up, it remains one of the scariest films in this franchise, even though it has a lot of campy and cheesy moments. And one of my favorite things about this original film is just how it contains the DNA of everything this franchise would go on to be. This is the template that every movie is following here afterwards. It is genuinely unsettling and brutal at times. It has moments of exaggerated chaos that somehow become entertaining without really ruining the horror aspect. That balance is something very few filmmakers can really achieve, but Raimi did it. Well, I think he was still in college. But the reason it's coming in right in the middle at number 3 here to me is just because I feel like I love the original, but Bruce Campbell's Ash feels more like a traditional horror protagonist here. And it's not until later on in the series where Raimi and Bruce Campbell really figured out who the character of Ash is supposed to be. The supporting cast is not all that memorable. None of these things hurt the movie too much, but ultimately, I know where Ash is going to be eventually, and I'd rather watch the more entertaining versions of him. So that aspect alone kind of holds this one back for me just a little bit, but still very positive because at number 3, we got the original The Evil Dead. But coming in at number 2 is going to be Evil Dead 2013. And in my opinion, I think this is one of the greatest horror remakes and sequels ever made. And honestly, I don't think Fede Alvarez really gets enough credit for what he was able to pull off with this film here. I mean, rebooting or doing your own version of horror's most beloved franchise, in my opinion, without Ash Williams or Raimi super involved feels like a disaster waiting to happen. But instead of trying to just copy what Raimi did, Fede here, he takes the Evil Dead formula in a completely different direction while also feeling very familiar at the same time. In my opinion, it feels almost like a remake and a sequel same time, really honoring that original film while also carving out its own identity. The original trilogy often pushed itself into that horror comedy aspect, but this movie really just dives deep into pure terror and brutality. The Deadites feel relentless, the practical gore is absolutely insane, and there are multiple scenes that make me wince and have that incredible phantom pain moment no matter how many times I've sat down and watched them. It's one of the very few horror movies where I still catch myself kind of looking away at certain sequences or playing them over in my head long after I watched it. And one thing I really appreciate is just the characters and the believable setup here. The detox storyline with the character of Mia gives everyone a very logical reason to stay at the cabin and creates these genuinely emotional stakes and situations that most Evil Dead movies don't even bother with. And it fixes a lot of the typical horror movie logic issues while also making the relationships and family dynamic feel much more grounded and realistic. And Jane Levy as Mia completely owns this movie. Watching Mia go from the person that everyone doubts and struggles to believe to the final survivor, the final girl in this movie is such a satisfying character arc to watch. And I genuinely think the blood rained filled finale is one of the greatest endings in any movie I've ever seen in my entire life. It is brutal, unforgettable, and somehow manages to both be epic and deeply personal all at the same time here. Between this one and my first one was kind of a tough decision, but the only reason that this one kind of gets held back for me is just because I prefer the more balanced horror comedy aspect that another one gives me, which will be my number 1 here because this movie doesn't have too many flaws to me. I mean, really outside of Eric reading the Book of the Dead a little too conveniently, I really don't have many complaints because this is a fantastic Evil Dead movie. Just when I'm going back and watching the Evil Dead movies, there's just one more that I would rather rewatch in my opinion. But as far as modern horror remakes and sequels go, Evil Dead 2013 is pretty much perfect. But with that said, obviously my number 1 is going to be Evil Dead 2. And I think this movie in particular perfectly defines what the Evil Dead franchise is. If nobody's ever seen an Evil Dead movie, this is the first one that I think I'm going to show them. To me, Evil Dead 2 just captures everything perfectly. It has horror, scare scenes, the creativity, the comedy, the practical effects, the Deadites, and Bruce Campbell just fully leaning into that Ash persona. It feels like the ultimate edition of the Evil Dead formula. And I feel like the original Raimi did a great job at his creativity, but this is where it kind of all comes together for him. The camera work, the sound design, the practical effects, and the nonstop energy just makes this story situation just feel bigger, louder, and way more confident. Every sequence somehow finds a new way to kind of surprise me. After all these years and all these times that I've seen it, I always take away something new and different from this film. And more than anything, this is Bruce Campbell's movie. And if you want to see Bruce Campbell be Bruce Campbell, you watch this movie. This is where Ash stops being a traditional horror survivor and becomes one of the greatest horror protagonists ever created, whether he's fighting his own possessed hand in that iconic scene, losing his mind while the cabin laughs and dances with him, or finally strapping on the chainsaw with his iconic groovy line. Every moment builds towards the legend that the rest of this franchise franchise is really built around. And this is probably one of my favorite examples of balancing horror and comedy where neither side takes away from each other. This movie can have you laughing 1 minute and genuinely unsettled the next, having a great time with the blood-soaked situations, but then also thinking about how fucked up and messed up it is. Raimi somehow makes possessed furniture, gallons of blood, and ashes complete mental breakdown terrifying but funny all at the same time. And I really haven't seen a movie balance it as well as Evil Dead 2 does. And when I look at the entire franchise, every movie does something exceptionally well here. For example, Evil Dead is very atmospheric. Evil Dead 2013 is way more brutal. Army of Darkness is more ambitious. On top of that, Evil Dead 2 is the one that kind of really brings those strengths together for me in the complete package. It doesn't necessarily have the scariest or bloodiest moments compared to our newer films, but it balances everything and gives me the character of Ash that I adore and I love. And that's why for me, Evil Dead 2 isn't just my favorite Evil Dead movie. It is one of my favorite horror movies that I've ever seen and experienced. So easily to me, coming in at number 1, we got Evil Dead 2. But you guys have my official Zach Cinema ranking. Please down below, let me know your personal ranking of the Evil Dead franchise. I've never seen the Evil Dead TV show, so if you want to include that, please include that. I've always been curious to check it out. Maybe one day I eventually will, but let me know your list. Let me know if you agree with my list, disagree, somewhere in the middle. Let me know your thoughts and feelings down below. But I appreciate anybody watching, especially if you've kept up with my entire review series. This was a ton of fun to do, and I'm kind of sad that it's over. This is the most positive franchise I've ever reviewed, and I don't know if I'll ever have something like this again. But with that said, that's about it. You guys have my thoughts. I appreciate anybody watching my videos, so thank you so much. And yeah, look forward to more Zach Cinema coming very soon.